Okay, so we are going to be revisiting evolution. Last week we looked and focused on the origin of life, but here we're going to be focusing on the evidence for evolution. Now, at the beginning of the year, we looked at evolutionary theory, and that was our focus on Darwinian theory of natural selection. But as we have learned about biochemistry and genetics, we're returning to how we are able to use or looking specifically at the evidence for evolution and how evolution occurs over time and how there are changes in the genes over evolutionary time. So, this is Evolution Revisited. And for this week, we'll be focusing specifically on evidence that are preserved in fossils. So, firstly, what are fossils exactly? And fossils are more than just dinosaur fossils. But here, fossils provide information about extinct species. So, those are species that have died out. Fossils can be large and perfectly preserved as an entire animal. They can also be as small as bacteria, developing embryos, or pollen grains. So, last week I had you guys view that documentary from HHMI Biointeractive called The Day the Mesozoic Died. So, a significant part, like a very decent part of the curriculum, the next generation science standards that we teach from, is about mass extinctions. And one of the most well-known and significant mass extinctions is the mass extinction of the dinosaurs. So there's multiple pieces of evidence that have allowed us to learn more about the extinction of dinosaurs that happened 65 million years ago. And we have fossil evidence and bone evidence of the dinosaurs. And one piece of evidence that we also have around that extinction time was fossilized evidence of foraminiferans or forams, like you guys had seen in the video. And you saw that underneath the KT boundary, the Cretaceous Tertiary boundary, those forams were more diverse, they were larger, and then on top of the boundary, they were smaller and they were less diverse. So that is very characteristic of what happens during a mass extinction event. And as we go through and talk about evidence for evolution, we'll be coming back to fossils. As we talk about different patterns of evolution, we'll be coming back to that mass extinction. So there were also different fossils of various pollen grains. And therefore, again, going back to here, fossils are not just fossilized bones, but they can be pieces of pollen grains and very small organisms, microscopic organisms. Teeth, pieces of jawbone, petrified wood, bits of leaf, footprints, burrows, tracks, even droppings. They can be preserved in amber. Most are in sedimentary rocks, but they can also be preserved in ice as well. So back to here. And these are the eggs of an oviraptor. And that's the size of an oviraptor compared to a human. This is a megalodon tooth as big as a human hand. Right here is the fossil of a particular it's a transitional fossil of something called Archaeopteryx, and that's spelled down here. So it's pronounced Archaeopteryx. We call it a transitional fossil because it's a transitional form between a reptile and a bird. So it has characteristics that are similar to a reptile and similar to a bird. And it is a transitional form, as is this right here. This is a fossil that represents a transitional form between land and water. So these are these are all different significant fossils, and this is how fossils form. So, a dead fish sinks to the bottom of a lake, and as long as there are no scavengers, that body will be covered up by sediment, hence why it is typically preserved in sedimentary rock. So the bones may be preserved in the rock, and an imprint of the skeleton may be preserved depending upon time. Now, not many organisms may fossilize because one key component is that the organism must not be picked up by scavengers. The remains must be preserved. And so sometimes there may be an event such as a mudslide that may trap a particular organism, because in a sudden mudslide, all of that sediment is able to trap an organism in place, and therefore any type of scavenger is not able to get there in order to consume the particular organism, for example. So, I believe, okay, so now, in order to date fossils and to understand how we place this in the geologic time scale, there's different ways that we have to date the fossils. There's two types of dating. There's the type of dating that we have that is called relative dating. And then there's another type of dating that we call absolute dating. So the first type of dating that we are going to discuss is that of relative dating. So this is just basically the idea that as sediments and as layers of rock form, the oldest rock layers, or what we say strata, form on the bottom, and then the older rock layers, and then the younger rock layers start to form on top. So the oldest, then younger and younger and younger, then youngest on top. So the law of superposition states that wind and water deposit layers of sediment and soil over the years. So this will harden and create different strata or layers in the rock. So strata is the plural of stratum. So it's just strata is just a fancy way of saying layers. So the lower layers are older than the upper layers, the strata, and all organisms that are found within the same strata are the same relative age. So if we go over here, and these 1, 2, 3, and 4 represent what are called outcrops. So imagine that it's like, I don't know if it's a silly analogy, but imagine that it's like a loaf of bread, or maybe a better analogy is like a cake. And I've cut one slice, a second slice, a third slice, and a fourth slice. So that's a slice of the cake, that's a slice of the cake, etc. All right, so this one that looks like a brick is a layer, like with a brick pattern. This one, not with any pattern, is another layer. This one with the dashed background is another layer. And this one with no background is another layer. So this one on the bottom is the oldest layer. This one with the brick pattern is the youngest layer. So if I go to this one with the dashed lines, every fossil that you would find in this layer is the same relative age. And then every fossil in this layer is the same relative age. And based upon the law of superposition, we can then determine that the fossils that are found in this top layer are younger than the fossils, for example, in this layer. That's the idea. So, something called an index fossil helps us to also determine the age. An index fossil is a fossil. So if we think about what an index is in a book, we refer to an index to help us to find a particular place in the book. And an index fossil helps us to place a particular time in order to determine the relative age of a fossil. So, an index fossil is very common in the fossil layers, and it's usually in a particular rock layer, and it's common in the fossil record. So, here, the diagrams below represent the rock layers and fossils found at 4 widely separated rock outcrops. Which fossil appears to be the best index fossil? So I'm going to use this as an example to explain to you what index fossils are. So if you go to choice B, it just looks like this little stick, and it's just found in this particular spot here. So it would not be a good index fossil because it's not commonly found in the fossil records. So we can eliminate B as being a good index fossil. So let's go to A, which kind of looks like this shell, this like clam shell. So A, right here, is not a particularly good index fossil. And this is because we see it in every single layer, as we see here in Outcrop 2. We see it in the first, second, third, and fourth layer. So if we find, it doesn't allow us to pinpoint a particular point in time because it's not really in one specific layer. If we go, however, to this, I would say that's a nautilus, like that type of shell. Here, we see that it is common to all the outcrops, so to all the sections, so it's common in the fossil records, but it's also constrained to this particular layer. So we're able to kind of constrict it to just a particular range of time in the fossil record. And that's what makes it a good index fossil. So if I find fossil X, so a fossil that's not here, if I find fossil X and I see that it is in a layer with this nautilus, I can get a relative age of that fossil. So when we talk about dating fossils, there's two methods. There's the relative, when we use the age of one fossil layer to determine the age. So here are the fossil layers. So let's say I know the age of this fossil layer. If I get a fossil on top of that layer, it would be younger. If it's underneath that layer, it would be older. The absolute age gives the actual age. So that's the difference. Now, if we go back here, the absolute age is determined using radioactive isotopes. So, radioactive isotopes decay at a regular rate over time. Using that idea, we can determine the absolute age of a fossil. So one is carbon-14. That's radioactive. And it has a half-life of 5,700 years. And there are all different isotopes that have different half-lives. But basically, we measure what's left in a sample. And that's how we're able to determine the absolute age. But it's what it decays into. So, for example, and please don't feel like you have to memorize any of this. You absolutely do not have to, but carbon-14 decays at a regular rate into nitrogen-14. Potassium-40 is an isotope that regularly decays into argon-40. That decays into this. These decay into that. So, as they decay at a regular rate, we can measure the proportion in order to determine the age, is the point and idea. So, we can use something called radiocarbon dating. And these radioactive isotopes are unstable. So therefore, the nucleus is breaking down over time. Now, carbon-14 breaks down into nitrogen. So we actually do have radioactive carbon-14 in us, and it does break down. And as we eat and consume food, we actually take in more carbon-14. So as we eat, we consume more carbon-14 actually, in fact. But when that organism dies and it fossilizes, that organism is no longer eating, and so it's no longer taking in carbon-14. So therefore, it's decaying over time. So here is a fossil that has just formed, right, at the time that the organism has died. So we would say that, right, whatever carbon-14 there is, 100% of it is there. All of the carbon-14 exists. Now, every isotope has a particular half-life. The half-life for carbon-14 is 5,730 years. You may hear me just say 5,700. Okay? So 5,700 years later, it is starting to decay and break down because the isotope is unstable. So the carbon-14 is starting to break down in nitrogen. So half of that carbon is breaking down into nitrogen. So here we had 100% carbon. And here, now we only have half the carbon left. And now half of it has become nitrogen. Then 5,700 years later, it continues to decay. And then another 5,700 years later, it continues to decay. So we measure the amount that's left in order to determine the absolute age. And we can use different isotopes for different ages of fossils. And here's an example of that, perhaps a better picture. Here is carbon-14, and there's 3 different isotopes, if you remember us talking about this at the beginning of the year. But we have carbon-12, carbon-13, and carbon-14, and they're all absorbed by living organisms. Now, at death, 100% of the carbon may be carbon-14. And since it's an unstable isotope, it's breaking down over time. And 50% of the carbon-14 remains because 50% of it decayed into nitrogen. And then another 5,700 years later, 50% of this decayed. So now we have 25% left. And then another 5,700 years later, 25% of that decayed. So we just have 12.5% of that left. And potassium 40 is just yet another isotope. So that is the concept, but here's a graphic representation of that. So this is the fraction of potassium 40 present. And after one half-life, 1.1 billion years pass by. So we can use potassium 40 to date even older fossils than carbon 14. So after 1.2 billion years, half of the potassium 40 is left. That's one half-life. Then after a second half-life, only 1/4 of it remains, and our fossil is 2.4 billion years old. And then after a third life, half of that remains, so it's 1/8, and the arrow is just slightly off and like what it's pointing to, but 3.6 billion years will have passed by that time. So we can place these fossils along the geologic timescale. And, in the last week, you guys looked at the geologic timescale, learning about the Cenozoic era, the Mesozoic era, the Paleozoic era, and the Precambrian time. So the inclusion of this here is just like, okay, we talked about this last week. And then when we look at geologic time as a clock, if a formation of Earth happened at midnight, this is where we would place all of those events, where humans would have just appeared at the time 11:58 p.m. and 56 seconds. And we're able to place this based on the ability to find fossils and to date those fossils. And like I said, there are fossils that have formed that have been microscopic. And the extinction of the dinosaurs, a lot of the stuff that we have learned about the dinosaurs is what you guys had seen in the day that the Mesozoic died. Now, what you guys will be doing this week is you'll be looking at an Explore Learning gizmo where you will be building Pangea. And the significance of that is that you are kind of connecting two ideas. You are going to be connecting and learning about continental drift, and you'll be connecting ideas about fossil evidence, because the idea is that as we're going ahead, we're looking at evidence for evolution, but first of all, we're focusing on fossil evidence and connecting it to a changing Earth. So what you see here is the changing continents, right? Here's what the continents looked like in the Carboniferous period, the Triassic periods, the Cretaceous periods, and then right underneath this video is what the continents look like today. So physical forces such as Earth's regional climate, and therefore all external environmental factors that climate includes, have changed repeatedly over millions of years. So many changes were triggered by fairly small shifts in global temperature. So there was a global heat wave in the Mesozoic, and then we've had the ice ages. So these environmental changes occurred as geological forces built mountains, moved continents, and created island chains like the Galapagos and Hawaiian Islands. Continental drift produced even more dramatic changes. So at the end of the Permian, the continents formed Pangea. For example, as South America moved, it became warmer. Also, the Indian subcontinent, that Himalayan mountain range is there. because the Indian subcontinent is moving underneath Asia. And as it's doing that, it's kind of forcing the plate up. And that mountain range, the Himalayan mountain range, is actually getting taller and taller as time moves forward because the Indian subplate is actually moving underneath it, pushing it up. The continents move at a rate of about 3 centimeters per year. And the space between South America and Africa is just widening over time. So it's really interesting. But at some point, going back to India, the Himalayas, and Asia, there used to be water. There used to be like a sea between India and Asia, but due to continental drift, that pushed all that together. And that's a changing planet with changing continents, movement in continental plates, and there's changes in the climate that have occurred over time with that. And if there's changes in the climate, that also leads to changes in the ecosystem. So, changes in external factors alter ecological interactions among organisms and between organisms and their environments. So, change interactions in turn change the pressures of natural selection, favoring adaptation to new conditions. The emergence of new habitats and changes in environment of existing habitats create new niches. New niches offer opportunities for natural selection to increase diversity among species. Continental drift shaped the biogeography or distribution of fossils and living organisms. For example, Africa and South America are now separated by the Atlantic Ocean, but fossils of the Mesosaurus have been found on both continents. So this is how big the Mesosaurus was compared to a human, but we find that on both South America and Africa. So at one point that would have been found on both continents, suggesting that it was able to roam on a land that was once connected. So those changes alter the pressures of natural selection in ways that favored the evolution of different adaptations, new organisms, and new groups of organisms. What you see here is a fossil of a plant species that was found in Antarctica. So Antarctica was not always exactly at the South Pole. And if currently you can't really find like a diversity of plant life on Antarctica, obviously. But at some point in Earth's history, there was a greater diversity of plant life on Antarctica. And there's fossil evidence of that. So as continents drift, there's just changing conditions. For example, as South America moves further south, the climate changes in accordance with that. And as that happens, as the environment changes, the niches change with that. And therefore, the organisms and the species that are there, they become adapted in different ways. So there's different opportunities for natural selection. So, what are the effects on life? So changes in climate, geologic forces, and biological forces have had effects on life. The mountains in South America hold fossils of sea stars and marine mollusks that are about 400 million years old. And the fossils are evidence that these rocks were once part of a shallow seafloor teeming with life, such as the modern day ocean floor shown. So it's interesting to think about how the Earth has changed over time, over millions and millions of years. In our own lifetime, it's not as dramatic. But again, we can look at fossil evidence to see how this has happened and to see using relative and absolute dating and place this along a geologic time span where and when these events would have occurred. But again, these mountains in South Africa look like this. And then the question is, how are we able to find marine life here? Even in New Jersey, there are marine fossils further inland, suggesting that the shoreline was further inward. And there are fossils of like the woolly mammoth and like land mammals that are further out in the ocean, suggesting that the shoreline was kind of further back. It's all interesting stuff. So we are stopping there because the goal, the focus this week was more so on fossil evidence, and then we'll be getting into different types of evidence next week. So that's it.